Jack Walker stepped through the grand entrance of Westwood Prime, a glittering fortress of luxury nestled in the heart of Beverly Hills. The chandeliers above gleamed like ice, casting shimmering light on velvet booths and sharply dressed clientele. The clinking of wine glasses and soft murmurs of wealthy elites painted a picture of exclusivity. But Jack, with his weathered boots, faded jeans, and leather jacket, worn thin by time, seemed like a misprint in a perfectly styled magazine. He walked in with quiet confidence, taking in the lavish surroundings without a hint of insecurity. Yet to Bradley, Westwood Prime's senior waiter, newly promoted to shift manager Jack, was nothing more than an unwelcome stain on the pristine image he worked so hard to protect. Bradley noticed Jack the moment he entered, and within seconds had already written his judgment in stone. To Bradley, who relished his role as gatekeeper to the elite, Jack wasn't just underdressed, he was an intrusion. His tailored black vest was freshly pressed, and his hair slicked back with precision. Bradley believed he embodied the restaurant's high standards. He leaned toward a junior waiter and muttered under his breath with a smirk, "We've got a cowboy trying to dine with royalty." His disdain was not subtle. He made sure guests at nearby tables caught the joke. Smirking as he adjusted his tie and approached Jack with forced charm, masking his contempt with a plastic smile. "Good evening," Sir Bradley said in a syrupy tone, his words coated in condescension. "Can I help you, Jack?" Simply nodded and said, "I'm here for dinner." Bradley's eyes flicked over Jack's clothes as if they were offensive. "Of course," he replied, his smile tightening. "We'll see what we can do." Without bothering to check the reservation list, he ushered Jack past polished tables and well-dressed patrons to the very back, where the clatter of the kitchen and the smell of dishwater lingered in the air. With a dramatic flourish, Bradley pulled out a chair next to the swinging kitchen doors, saying, "A perfect seat for someone. Unique." He dropped a menu onto the table with an audible thud and walked off without another word. Jack, however, remained unshaken. He looked around calmly, taking in his surroundings. His posture never shifted. His breathing remained steady. There was no embarrassment, no anger, just an unshakable poise that made a few guests glance twice. Some noticed the unfairness of his placement, whispering among themselves. Jack scanned the menu with genuine interest, as if he were seated in the finest spot in the room. When the junior waiter returned with water, Jack thanked him warmly, his voice deep and sincere, creating a jarring contrast to Bradley's icy demeanor. His presence, though quiet, began to shift the energy of the room. As Bradley returned to check in, his sarcasm sharpened. "Enjoying your view of the kitchen," he sneered. Jack looked up at him, smiled slightly, and said, "It's not the view that matters. It's how people treat each other. That's what defines a place." The words landed with a soft but undeniable impact. Bradley's smirk faltered. Just a touch. Jack's comment wasn't aggressive or defensive. It was truthful, the kind of truth that lingers longer than a shouted insult. But Bradley, clinging to his fragile sense of superiority, waved it off and returned to the front with exaggerated indifference. Across the dining room, a few guests like Richard Evans, a silver-haired man in a navy suit, began to watch more closely. They had seen the way Jack had been treated and how he carried himself in response. Unlike many who might have stormed out or argued, Jack stayed steady, dignified, and oddly at home among the chaos of snobbery and shallow judgments. It was subtle, but something about the way he existed in that space challenged the norms of Westwood Prime. He didn't need validation. He didn't flinch. And as the night wore on, it became clear that Jack Walker might not be the man Bradley thought he was, and that this dinner would be far more than just a meal. It would be a reckoning. Bradley, still seething over Jack's composure and unbothered attitude, found himself growing increasingly irritated. To him, Jack's calm demeanor wasn't a display of dignity. It was defiance, and Bradley wasn't used to being defied. As he passed Jack's table with a pitcher of ice water, the plan formed in his mind with cruel precision. He feigned a stumble, and the contents of the pitcher came cascading down in a cold torrent, soaking Jack's jeans and splashing across the floor. Gasps echoed from nearby tables as the icy water spread. "Oh dear," Bradley said with exaggerated faux concern, his voice laced with venom. "Terribly sorry, sir. These things happen, especially when we're busy serving our real guests." Jack looked down at his drenched clothes, then slowly up at Bradley, his face expressionless. There was no panic in his eyes, no aggression. Instead, he picked up his napkin and began to dab at the water with calm, deliberate movements. "Accidents happen," he said softly, "though I'm starting to think this one wasn't entirely accidental." The comment hung in the air like a challenge, subtle but firm. Bradley's smirk faltered, for the briefest moment, then returned with even sharper edges. "Well," he snapped under his breath, "maybe you'd be more comfortable somewhere that doesn't have a dress code." He turned on his heel, retreating toward the front with satisfaction, thinking he'd won another small victory. The dining room began to buzz. At a nearby table, Chad and Vanessa, a socialite couple dressed in coordinated gold and silk, exchanged glances and chuckled. "Honestly, he looks like he wandered in from the street." Chad muttered loud enough for others to hear. Vanessa giggled behind her champagne flute, amused more by the drama than the food, but not everyone was entertained. Natalie, a poised woman in her early 40s, wearing a sapphire blue dress, furrowed her brow as she observed the scene. That was uncalled for. She whispered to her friend Richard Evans. The seasoned businessman in the corner hadn't said a word, but his eyes were locked on Jack, the kind of gaze that missed nothing. Despite the humiliation, Jack's presence didn't waver. As Bradley returned briefly with a menu tucked under his arm, Jack raised a hand slightly and said, "Actually, I'd like to place an order." Bradley scoffed, ready for more mockery, but Jack looked him square in the eyes. "I'll have the foie gras." "Rossini," he said clearly. The room stilled. The dish, known for its decadent preparation and $350 price tag, was a statement. It wasn't just food, it was a line drawn in the sand. Bradley blinked. For a second, his mask slipped. "You do realize that dish is $350, right?" he said, his voice low. "I'm aware." Jack replied, his smile calm and polite. "It sounds wonderful." The shock rippled across the restaurant like a silent wave. Natalie leaned back. The impressed Richard tilted his glass toward Jack with a subtle nod of respect. Even Vanessa's smirk began to fade. Her laughter, quieting what they had dismissed as a random intruder, now seemed different. Who was this man who didn't flinch in the face of mockery, who sat soaked in water and yet ordered the most expensive item on the menu as if he owned the place? Bradley, however, couldn't afford to back down. The more Jack stayed composed, the more unbalanced Bradley became. He scrawled the order down with a heavy hand, muttering something inaudible before storming off toward the kitchen. But now the tables had turned. He was no longer in control. Jack's quiet authority was shifting the energy of the entire restaurant, exposing something ugly behind the polished facade. And though the night was still young, the seeds of a deeper unraveling had already been sown. What began as a simple dinner was quickly becoming a defining test for Jack, for Bradley, and for everyone watching. Bradley returned to Jack's table with a checkbook tucked tightly under his arm, wearing a grin as sharp as a dagger. He approached like a man preparing to deliver a final blow, tapping the leather folder against his palm with theatrical flair. "I trust everything was to your liking," he said with a syrupy sneer, placing the bill down with 2 deliberate taps on the table. "And just so we're clear, gratuity is not included," he added loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "We expect a minimum of 20%, assuming that's manageable." The arrogance in his tone was unmistakable. He had spent the evening crafting a narrative in his mind that Jack was a pretender, someone about to stumble out in embarrassment as soon as he saw the total. Jack didn't flinch. He reached calmly into his worn leather jacket and pulled out a sleek matte black credit card with an embossed silver emblem, one that immediately turned heads. The atmosphere in the room changed in an instant. Bradley's smirk faltered his brow, tightening as his eyes locked on the card. It wasn't just any credit card. It was a private banking card reserved for the ultra-wealthy, the kind of financial tool that didn't just grant access, but influence. Before Bradley could respond, a voice interrupted the moment. Mr. Walker came a clear professional tone. Gregory Langston, Westwood Prime's general manager, appeared beside Bradley, his tailored navy suit crisp and his expression tense. "My sincerest apologies, sir," Gregory said, offering a subtle bow. "We had no idea you were dining with us tonight. Please allow me to handle everything personally. Your meal, of course, is complimentary." The entire room fell into stunned silence. Silverware was set down mid-bite. Conversations froze. Several guests gasped quietly as realization swept through the space. The man they had judged the one Bradley had humiliated wasn't an outsider. He was one of the owners. Bradley's throat tightened, the blood draining from his face. He looked like he had been slapped with the weight of his own arrogance. His voice caught in his throat, eyes darting around as if searching for an escape. But Jack remained calm, his eyes fixed on Bradley with quiet intensity. "No need," he said to Gregory. "I'll pay for my meal. But before we settle the bill, I think we need to have a conversation." The words were gentle, yet commanding. Every head turned as Jack stood, not with anger, but with presence. He looked Bradley in the eye. "Tell me," he asked softly, "what made you so sure I didn't belong here?" Bradley stammered. I didn't know," he muttered. Didn't know what Jack asked. That I had money, that I helped build this place, or that I deserved respect, just like any other guest. The silence was suffocating. Jack's voice remained calm, but it cut deeper than any insult. Then he paused, the tension at its peak. "Actually," Gregory Jack said, turning to the manager, "I've got a better idea than a conversation." He glanced toward the restaurant's main entrance and then back at Bradley. "I've invited a group of guests tonight. They'll be arriving in 10 minutes. They won't be dressed for a gala, and they may not look like they belong in a place like this, but they're my guests. And for 1 hour, Bradley here will serve them properly, with respect. If he can manage that, he keeps his job. If not, he's done." Gasps rippled through the room. Natalie sat up straighter. Richard Evans crossed his arms and nodded slowly in approval. Even Chad and Vanessa, who had previously laughed at Jack, exchanged uneasy glances. Bradley opened his mouth in protest, but nothing coherent came out. Gregory, now stone-faced, turned to Bradley. "You heard Mr. Walker get ready." Jack sat back down with Grace unfolding his napkin like nothing had happened. The storm had passed, but the reckoning had only begun. In one move, Jack had flipped the hierarchy of Westwood Prime on its head, and now the real test of dignity was about to begin. The 10 minutes Jack had given passed like an eternity for Bradley. He stood stiffly near the front desk, his jaw locked tight, his palms sweating through his pristine gloves. Then the door opened, and in walked the group Jack had mentioned, 6 casually dressed individuals whose appearances clashed violently with the polished elegance of Westwood Prime. One man wore a wrinkled flannel shirt, another a faded hoodie, while one woman had on a second-hand denim jacket that didn't belong in the same room as $1,000 handbags and tuxedoed hosts. Bradley's stomach turned to him. These weren't guests. They were a threat to everything he believed the restaurant stood for, but he forced a crooked smile, reminding himself of Jack's ultimatum. "Good evening," Bradley greeted through clenched teeth. "Welcome to Westwood Prime." His voice was strained, each word painfully polite. He led them to a prime table at the center of the dining room, one Jack had specifically requested. Every eye in the restaurant followed their path. The elite whispered behind their menus, some with snide amusement, others with curiosity. Bradley's movements were jerky as he pulled out chairs with mechanical haste. "Here are your menus," he said, slapping them down with forced grace. When one of the women, a middle-aged brunette, asked about the difference between the mushroom risotto and the truffle risotto, Bradley couldn't help himself. "Well," he said with biting sarcasm, "if you have to ask, you probably can't afford either." There was a pause. The woman blinked in shock, but before she could respond, the man in the flannel shirt chuckled. "Wow, friendly service," he said, his voice dry. "You must really love your job." Bradley flushed but turned away before he could lose control. He stormed back toward the kitchen, muttering under his breath. "This is a circus," he growled. "This whole thing is a joke." Yet he had no choice but to return to the table minutes later to take their orders. His tone hadn't softened. "So what'll it be?" he asked curtly, tapping his pen impatiently. Then came the twist. The man in the hoodie leaned back with a grin and said, "I'll have the foie gras." Rossini, Bradley froze. "You're joking," he said flatly. "Do I look like I'm joking?" the man replied, still smiling before Bradley could lash out. A quiet cough came from Jack's table. Jack rose and walked over the entire restaurant, watching in anticipation. "Is there a problem?" Bradley Jack asked, voice calm but firm. "They can't possibly afford." Bradley began, but Jack cut him off. "Afford what? The same dish I ordered? Or is it that you've decided again who belongs and who doesn't?" Then the man in the hoodie stood revealing himself. "Oh, and by the way," he said, turning to Bradley, "you might want to be more careful who you insult. I'm Eric Malone, senior critic at Cuisine Report." The name hit like a thunderclap. Eric Malone, the notoriously influential food writer whose reviews had sunk restaurants in days. The room exploded into hushed gasps. Bradley's face turned ashen. For the rest of the hour, things only got worse. Bradley spilled wine on a guest's sleeve, snapped when asked for a refill, and muttered insults under his breath. By the time the clock struck the end of the hour, it was clear to everyone he had failed the test. Jack approached once more, his expression unreadable. "You had one job," he said softly. "Serve with respect. You couldn't do it." Bradley braced for termination, heart pounding, but Jack didn't fire him. Instead, he offered something else entirely. "Starting tomorrow, you'll report to the Haven Table, our non-profit restaurant downtown. For 1 month, you'll serve the homeless, the poor, the overlooked, the kind of people you've spent your career mocking. If you learn something, you can come back. If not, you're done." Bradley's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The room was silent. Even the usual clinking of plates and murmurs of high society gossip had stopped. Jack didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked back to his table, leaving Bradley to absorb the gravity of the moment. Guests stared, not with sympathy, but with judgment. Natalie nodded in approval. Richard Evans raised his wineglass ever so slightly. Eric Malone, already jotting in his notepad, smirked. "That'll be one hell of a review," he murmured. The night that Bradley had once controlled had spiraled into a humbling spectacle, and now his only path forward required something he had never shown before: humility. In the days that followed, Bradley's world shifted from velvet-lined dining rooms to the worn wood floors of the Haven Table, Jack's modest but bustling charity restaurant in the heart of downtown Los Angeles. Gone were the chandeliers and polished marble, replaced by mismatched chairs, chipped ceramic mugs, and the aroma of simple meals prepared with care. At first, Bradley resented every second of it. He saw the guests, many homeless, some mentally ill, others just struggling to survive. As beneath him, every plate he delivered felt like a reminder of his humiliation. Every conversation, a test of patience he thought he was too important to take. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, something began to change. On his third day, a little girl tugged at his sleeve and handed him a crumpled thank you note drawn in crayon. Her mother, seated beside her with sunken eyes and calloused hands, smiled with such genuine gratitude that Bradley didn't know what to do. That evening he stayed behind to help clean the kitchen, something no one asked him to do. A week later, he caught himself asking a guest if they preferred extra rice or more vegetables, and he meant it. He began listening to stories. One man had lost his family in a fire. Another had once been a teacher. Bradley started seeing faces, not stereotypes, people, not problems. And for the first time in years, he felt the weight of his own arrogance pressing in on him like a stone he'd carried too long without noticing. Meanwhile, back at Westwood Prime, the ripples of that unforgettable night hadn't faded. Guests still whispered about Jack Walker's quiet reveal and the infamous critic Eric Malone. But the biggest shift came from someone who had been silent until the very end: Richard Evans. The silver-haired businessman who had watched everything unfold approached Gregory, the restaurant's general manager, a few days later. "I'd like to speak with Jack Walker," Richard said calmly. "I want to fund the Haven table entirely." Gregory, stunned, asked why. Richard gave a small, nostalgic smile. "Because I was once like the people Bradley mocked." He explained. "I wore second-hand suits and was laughed out of rooms. Someone believed in me when I had nothing. It's my turn to pay it forward." The news reached Jack as he sat reviewing next month's meal plans for the charity. When he heard what Richard had done, he didn't smile or celebrate. He simply nodded quietly, acknowledging the power of a single night to change more than just one man. Bradley was still at the restaurant that day, scrubbing dishes beside a college student volunteer. When Jack entered, Bradley froze, unsure of what to say. "How's it going?" Jack asked, harder than Westwood. Bradley hesitated, then nodded. "But more honest," he said. "More real." Jack clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Then maybe you're starting to see the real meaning of service." As word spread, the Haven table became more than just a meal stop. It became a symbol. Volunteers from across the city signed up guests who once hid in shame now dined with dignity. Even a few Westwood Prime regulars donated quietly without seeking attention. One by one, people began to realize that what Jack had done wasn't about punishment. It was about planting seeds, seeds of humility, of empathy, of second chances. Bradley continued his month without complaint, and on his final day he returned to Westwood Prime not in triumph, but with a quiet resolve. He greeted guests with sincerity, not smugness. He made eye contact. He listened. And though some staff still looked at him sideways, most could see it. He had changed. The story of that night and what followed lived on. Not in viral clips or headlines, but in the hearts of those who saw it unfold. It became a tale whispered between servers during training shifts, shared by regulars over wine and retold by volunteers at the Haven table. It wasn't a story about power or status. It was about something deeper. Jack Walker had reminded them all that true value isn't found in designer shoes or black cards, but in how we treat one another when no one's watching. And as Bradley placed a tray of meals before three men in battered coats, he smiled not because he was proud, but because he finally understood. Kindness, not judgment, is the mark of real class. If this story moved you, we invite you to be part of the Deep Inside HQ journey. Every story we tell shines a light on the power of compassion, integrity, and second chances, values our world needs now more than ever. Subscribe to our channel to explore more powerful narratives that challenge judgment, inspire empathy, and reveal the hidden truths behind everyday moments. Don't forget to like, share, and leave a comment below. Your voice adds meaning to every story we share. Let's grow a community where dignity always comes first.